They want to undo the 20th century. Let's face it. They think the 20th century is wrongly decided. Our social safety net, our civil rights laws, this sort of freedom of speech, doing away with Jim Crow, and they think all of that's wrongly decided. And so they'll work with anybody who wants to roll that back.
Hi, I'm Heidi Beidinger.
And I'm Stephanie Wilson, and you're listening to What the Gerrymander, our podcast about reclaiming and rebuilding our collective political power in MAGA-captured states. We hope this podcast inspires you to help build power and restore democracy in Red America. MAGA is using the same strategy of voter suppression, gerrymandering, and extreme culture wars across the country. If you live in a blue state, please consider adopting Indiana or another MAGA-captured state to help contest every seat and roll back autocracy. Today, we're talking to Ryan Busse, former gun industry executive and author of the book Gunfight, My Battle Against the Industry That Radicalized America. In 2020, he accepted a position as an advisor to Joe Biden's presidential campaign, and in 2021, he was hired as a senior advisor to the gun violence prevention group Giffords. He believes that MAGA is a Christo-fascist movement that wants to see a reemergence of Jim Crow, a rollback of civil rights, a removal of religious rights for minorities, and an authoritarian regime. Please listen. This episode is spicy, sometimes uncomfortable, and one of the most important conversations we've ever had.
Hello, Ryan, and welcome to What the Gerrymander.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's good to be with you guys today.
Absolutely. So before we get to your story and how you came to be a gun safety advocate, we're recording this on March 15th, and President Biden, I'm sure as you know, issued the executive order yesterday that strengthened some existing laws. Can you tell us more about what the gun industry thinks, what the reaction might be? And then the second part is, how does this intersect with the work that you're doing for the Gifford Foundation?
Well, so the reaction from the gun industry will, and it already is, and probably will be even more so, vociferous denunciation of those proposals from Biden. And it's not because they're radical in any way, because they're certainly not radical. I mean, strengthening background checks wasn't very long ago in the industry where everybody supported strengthening background checks. And so, those sorts of things are just basic common sense. He called on the Federal Trade Commission to issue a report about firearms advertising, specifically to kids, people below the age of 21. And I've been kind of hip deep in some of the egregiously irresponsible advertising that the industry is engaged in now. Again, this is sort of a recent issue with the industry. 15, 20 years ago, this sort of thing didn't happen. And I think importantly for the political work that you guys are doing, it's very critical that we realize how fast this has changed, how radical it is, how different from just common, responsible, reasonable gun ownership that so many people in Indiana and lots of other states still engage in and believe in. Very important that we carve off the radical, irresponsible stuff from just basic, reasonable, decent gun ownership.
Wow. So I'm hearing a couple of things that I want to follow up on. One is that you said that the executive order is really just kind of logical things that we used to have.
And kind of to you guys' podcast point, how is it that MAGA and red can swamp something that pulls at 82%, right? Ice cream doesn't pull at 82%. French fries and ketchup don't pull at 82%. But background checks, universal background checks do. And it's because this issue is so intertwined with the DNA of the Republican Party. It's square in the middle of MAGA politics. And so it's not like the background check thing isn't really even an issue. It's a value thing that's attached to this, like it's a pebble that's attached to a boulder that's attached to a mountain. And those things are right-wing MAGA politics. That's why this is so difficult to advance.
We're recording on March 15th, but this is going to air right before the NRA convention in Indianapolis. So when our listeners are listening, it'll be, in a couple of days. You talk about how the culture war started in the NRA well before you saw it happening out in the public.
Yeah.
Before MAGA even.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what you saw in terms of culture war? We've been doing a lot of talking about culture war issues because A, they're existential in some way for a lot of people, but B, it's the crux of the division in our society right now and a detraction from some of the legal issues that are happening. So if you could tell us what you saw back then and how you're seeing it echo now, that would be great.
Well, and I'll say this first off, I wrote that book largely because I'm often frustrated with progressives, Democrats, whatever it is that we call ourselves, often believing naively that we're in this issue by issue, polite sort of government, back and forth. Those are the rules of a bygone era. Okay. We are not fighting those rules anymore. And trust me, I know because I saw the development of this war that we're in now. And believe me, it's a war. You may not think it's a war. There are people in the Democratic Party who doesn't think it's a war. There are progressives who are not fighting it like a war. The other side believes it's a war. So if they think it's a war, it's a war.
That's right.
And so here's how it all developed. Nothing that we're experiencing now or that we observe on the right side of the political aisle with regards to radicalization and all of this just biting divisiveness, conspiracy theory, hatred, all the stuff that drives outcomes on the right, none of it I didn't experience 20 years ago in the firearms industry. It all has its seeds there. One of the first things that has to happen and that I saw happen is you have to convince your side, your people, that there is an existential battle for the very existence of their life, of their culture, of their race, of their religion, of whatever it is. And all the better if you can wind all those things together. That's important because once those people believe that they are aggrieved, attacked, that evil Bill Clinton or the Democrats or what is in the case of how it really started with the NRA, they're coming to get them, then importantly, there's nothing that they won't accept to fight back. And so while Democrats were scratching their heads in 2016, like, gosh, how did people vote for Donald Trump? And surely the fever will break and it will, within a week, they'll see how crazy he is. You don't understand. They've already accepted that they would vote for and support Trump and somebody 10 times worse than him because they're in an existential war. They're told that they must do anything to fight back the people who are, or the forces or whatever it is that are literally trying to snuff them out of existence. Same thing with people scratch their heads. Why did AR-15s and this radicalized January 6th and come and take it on flags and all these bumper stickers that we see on big trucks trying to tell us how big the guns are and how they're going to use them? And that's an acceptance of something meant to own the libs, to take back, to exert power. And there's nothing, not only will they accept and propagate AR-15s, they'd gladly take A-10 Warthogs and M1 Abrams tanks too.
Right.
That's why, and I saw all this developing. I saw it used very effectively by the NRA to first drive political outcomes, but the gun industry then said, holy crap, that's the same thing that sells guns. And there became this intertwining in about 02, 03, 04, and then 2004, Bush was reelected. 2005, he signs PLACA, which is this big liability coverage. 2007 and 8, Barack Obama starts to lead in the polls. 2008, he wins, and man, we're off to the races. Prior to 2008, the gun industry had never sold more than about 5.5, 6 million, 7 tops million guns in the United States in 1 year. By the time Barack Obama left office, the United States was consuming almost 17 million guns a year. So if you overlay gun sales with radicalization in the country, they mirror exactly, precisely. And the peak of gun sales was 2020, the most tumultuous year any of us have lived through. Kyle Rittenhouse, Black Lives Matter, COVID lockdowns, Portland, riots in the streets, counter riots, Trump calling National Guard, standing in front of churches with upside down Bibles, right? 23 million guns sold that year. So these issues are not separated at all. They're intertwined perfectly. The NRA for some time had tapped into, sort of accidentally, a whole bunch of conspiracy theories and ways of fomenting hate against the other. Racism, certainly a backlash against Muslim Americans, a backlash against the elite, air quotes here, a backlash against education. It's pretty easy to see how Barack Hussein Obama, our first Black president, a constitutional scholar from Harvard, who grew up as a community organizer in Chicago, how more perfectly could one man enumerate all of the conspiracies that the NRA had been fomenting for years? it almost seems like Obama was perfectly cast to be the NRA boogeyman because of all the things that all of his background, all of which I find very admirable. But he represented to the NRA and to the NRA faithful all of the evil conspiracies that they said would come to pass. In fact, nobody that I knew in the industry, and everybody knew kind of the shtick, right? Nobody in the industry called him President Obama. They called him America's best gun salesman. There's lots of articles on this because everybody in the firearms industry knew that he represented these things that would drive gun sales.
What was the point at which you said, no more? Like, I can't be part of this anymore. I can't change it from the inside. It's time for me to leave and write a book and speak out.
So I don't really mean it as pushback, but I think it's really important for people who are doing political work like you two and like the listeners of this podcast to understand that I don't think I changed very much. I think that the industry and ethos around me changed a lot. Now, eventually that did force me to make some modifications, to wake up some, to decide to fight back. But I got into the industry as a kid who grew up on a farm shooting with their father and their grandfather and their brothers, just like lots of kids in Indiana. Guns for me were something that were healthy and fun and represented some of the best times of my life. And I just naively thought for the first part of the time in my career that same sort of responsibility, like we would never carry a gun into a town, my grandfather. We would never think that they were part of our identity. We would never threaten to use them against fellow citizens. We would never not take hunter safety and safety certifications. That didn't even enter our thinking. And for the first part of my time in the industry, that's generally how most of the industry functioned. But the NRA tapped into this thing to take that sort of Americana and twist it into fear and hate. And I saw that happening. And yeah, I started fighting back. I guess I had a couple turning points. One in 2004, after I did a press conference at the National Press Club, where I stood up for wild places and conservation that I cared about, basically places that people use guns to hunt. And the NRA and the NSSF, the industry trade group, came after me and tried to get me fired. The other one, obviously Sandy Hook was horrific. My boys were the same as those boys at school. Sarah, my wife, called me that day. I was working at a gun company when that happened. A lot of people in the industry looked themselves in the mirror. I never stopped looking myself in the mirror. Most other people did. Within a week or two, they went back to work. But the one that really pushed me over the edge, the big industry trade show is called SHOT Show, Shooting, Hunting, Outdoor Trade Show. And it's every gun company, most of the gun companies in the world go to it. It's usually held in Las Vegas. In 2017, the last day of it corresponded with Trump's inauguration speech, a speech which came to be known as the American Carnage. And the industry shut down the trade show, even though there were people from probably 50 or 100 countries in there. They shut down the trade show, piped in the audio for the inauguration speech, and then probably 1,000 flat screen TVs in that trade show played it. And the place was as silent and as worshiping as a Catholic mass. And I stood around thinking, what in the hell have these people done? Because this sort of, and Trump's speech was, and I denote this in the book, but I heard direct copies of Wayne LaPierre's themes and some direct copies of his words in that speech. It was as if the NRA and the industry had elected itself as president. And I was scared to death. I came home and I told Sarah, I can't do this shit anymore.
That was a frightening moment. And I wanted to ask you about with the NRA. So the fact that they were all in for Trump and anybody like him, but probably particularly Trump obviously animates something in the audience that finds him particularly compelling. But in 14 and 15 and 16, the NRA started or was in the middle of a relationship with Russia, the whole Maria Butina situation.
Yeah.
How does that play? In 2019, the Senate bipartisan committee called the NRA a Russian asset. How do you think about that as complementing or in relation to everything that you saw going on from back 20 years prior?
Well, again, that's just another predictive precursor to what happened on the right side of the political aisle. Remember, the NRA decided if the enemy of my enemy is my friend, don't care who they are. I will accept anything. I will do anything. I will break any social norm. Anybody who comes in here and wants to contribute money to help us, upend this sort of liberal democracy thing we have over here, we're all in for. And so when Butina is walking around the trade show, when NRA executives are bragging about taking trips to Russia, when other companies are poking around Russia to find ammunition supplies, and all of this happened, like, that didn't shock me. Like, they had already made up their mind to accept. I mean, they would have accepted far worse. Right. And so now when people on the left scratch their heads like, gosh, how could these Republicans be for Putin? Well, I mean, it was happening 15 years ago in the gun industry, again, because they will accept anyone who is an enemy. They want to undo the 20th century. Let's face it. They think the 20th century is wrongly decided. Our social safety net, our civil rights laws, this sort of freedom of speech, doing away with Jim Crow. And they think all of that's wrongly decided. And so they'll work with anybody who wants to roll that back. I'm not shocked that they're siding with Putin.
What society are they trying to create? 23 million guns. So for us, who's sitting on the outside of this, who doesn't have that familiarity or the nostalgia for guns, and so we can't possibly fathom where the NRA is headed. Like, what's the end game?
I think you're giving the NRA too much credit. Now, I think people like Leonard Leo, the Federalist Society, and the Supreme Court, some conservative thinkers, they do have a long game. They are trying to do this white Christian nationalist. I think the NRA and other groups like the NRA they're sort of quarterly capitalist in a way. And in quarterly capitalism, you will do anything to make your next quarter, right? You'll sell your grandmother to make your next quarter. You got to make those sales numbers. You worry about the next quarter then. You just do what you got to do now. Well, all the NRA has cared about for the last 20, 25 years is money and power. Like, they don't know where it's going. But when the quarter for them is the election, then they sort of wake up after that like, well, geez, that's kind of a shitstorm, but okay, let's do the next one. And then it's the thinkers around that are utilizing the NRA, but the NRA is such an effective quarterly tool that's why they support Trump. That's why they support like the worst of the worst in Congress, the absolute Gates, Boebert. I mean, especially Boebert. She wears a pistol everywhere. Marjorie Taylor Greene. You go Representative Clyde from Georgia. Like, the worst Gosar, the worst of the worst bomb throwers, the insurrectionists, every one of them is NRA supported or NRA endorsed. Every single one. Because they will do what it takes to win the next election.
So just to be clear, then the bottom line, the quarterly report is more important than humanity. Correct. So if Wayne LaPierre's daughter, son, grandchildren, I don't know anything about his family, if one of them should be caught up in a mass shooting, would that have any effect on him whatsoever? If they were shot to death in a mass shooting, does Wayne LaPierre change the way that he approaches what he does?
Again, there's a lot of supposition there, and certainly I wish harm on no one, and I hope we never have to deal with that, and no family has to deal with that. I will tell you that the history of the NRA indicates that not only would that not change, that they would double down on that.
Double down.
They would say, see, we told you we need every single teacher there, every single kid to have more guns, not less. That's what I think would happen.
And I think that's what we have to make clear for our listeners, because I believe that those of us who believe in humanity and dignity and respect for life and the pursuit of happiness, that we believe that some part of humanity will emerge from all of this, right? That eventually we'll get to a point that we care about our fellow man. But the fact is, you've laid it out very articulately, that that's not the direction of the NRA. It's about the quarterly report. It's about power and guns, and that is it. And be damned to whoever's child is killed in the next mass shooting.
Yeah, and that's why I advise Giffords, and I've testified to Congress 3 times. I've written I don't know how many articles. And I think it's really important for people on the left to understand this really is not a policy battle. Democrats and progressives are really good at policy stuff, and I appreciate that.
Doesn't matter.
How we're generally on the right side of every policy and the wrong side of every message, I don't quite know. It's quite a skill we have, but that tends to be what we do. And the reason is, I think, because this is a culture war. It's not a policy battle. We have to win this war. I want to give people hope, because a lot of people are probably going to listen to this and they're probably seen some of the stuff I written and think, geez, it's going to get dark.
It is, Ryan. I mean, I've done, in the last few days, watched a lot of your interviews and so
Yeah.
forth, and walk away very hopeless, discouraged. I question, how could you be in the industry for 20 years?
Yeah.
How could you even be there for that long?
Yeah.
It's monstrous to our society.
I'm going to give everybody, I think, some hope about how to win this war.
Okay. That would be helpful.
So I write this book. I know I know what the other side is capable of. I have 2 boys. Sarah and I are married. We live in a very red place. We were worried about our physical safety. We're worried about our internet and digital safety. We're worried about we're worried about getting shot going to the grocery store. Honestly, I fly around all the time doing these interviews. And yet, and there's ugliness, and it's the kind of thoughtless ugliness that you guys probably get once in a while. It's really not great. Some of it is threatening, but I have been deluged by positive comments, a lot from center right, gun owners, gun owning families who say, "Thank you for doing this. It's gone too far. I'm a gun owner too, but these people are crazy. They're going to take down our country." My point is that authoritarian works because it keeps decent people quiet. And there are a lot of decent people out there. I'm still a gun owner. I hunt and shoot with my boys. I love to bird hunt. I have 3 bird dogs. My boys are in a trap shooting league. I don't want to give any of that up. I don't see any issue with any of it. And we have to reach those sorts of people. We have to tell them we're partnering with them in the pursuit of decency and responsibility. And we have to cast off this crazy 10, 20, 25%, whatever it is on the right that is controlling the conversation. We have to do that. They're out there. We just have to, we have to speak up and give them a hand. And again, the response to my book, I'm not kidding you, like 95.5 positive to negative. And it's exactly opposite what I thought it would be.
I'm actually not surprised at all. But one of the things I want to go back to is Heidi said, where's their humanity? How could they accept, the killing of other humans? And I think that moment, what they have been doing is, as history shows us, is creating an other that isn't human like them. That's the whole Christo-fascist, Christian nationalist, fascist ideology, is you pick a group that's marginal, you marginalize them more, you make them more other, and then you start dehumanizing them. And all of a sudden it doesn't really matter because they're not equal to you. They're not.
You pick the easy targets first, right? And then pretty soon it's going to be the tall kids, then it'll be the short kids, then it'll be the fat ones, then it'll be the brown ones, then it'll be the white ones. Like, they don't pick them all at one time. They pick the most marginalized first.
Exactly.
And they're very good at that. Also, Heidi, I think it's important, if you think of yourself in the trenches in World War I fighting, like, you're fighting a war. When people die, you're like, well, that's what happens in a war. Like, it is dehumanizing. But if you believe enough in the existential battle you're fighting in, you can look the other way from some horribly egregious things.
You're right. When you put it in that context, you can think those things away. You can rationalize that away. You're right about that. Except that if somebody actually dies, boy, that's hard to rationalize away. If somebody in your own circle.
It totally is. But again, Democrats and progressives need to understand the level of the battle that we are fighting. To get in with people who believe so deeply that they will accept, deaths as if they're in a war, it is not about little picayune policy crap. Like, even discussing that with them is just a waste of your breath. You're fighting something so much larger. And so, again, I think I didn't come on here to sell books, but I think that this sort of story of how most gun owners in the country are not okay with this craziness, right? The tactical market, such that it is now, controls the gun market. Tactical means planned military action. That's most of the guns that are being sold now are for planned military action. They're not self-defense guns. They're not hunting guns. They're for planned military action, tactical. And we need to understand that. And most gun owners ain't down with that either. This idea that, like, people can march into the Michigan Capitol with AR-15s and threaten the governor and lawmakers. Good, conservative people across Indiana, they ain't down with that. We have to give them a hand and say, look, we're the ones trying to save democracy. We're the ones trying to save your gun rights from the crazies. Partner with us.
Right. And also, we need to give them that permission structure so that they feel that they can do that.
Yeah.
One of the things that I want to just reinforce about what you said is that not only if you're in a war, you'll accept anything, but people who stand by aren't just quiet, they're complicit.
Yeah.
So authoritarians are extremely good at making people complicit, making people inform on each other, making your side that fully believes in your cause unable to leave because of what they have done toward the ultimate goal. And I think that as a part of this whole at war thing, there used to be in social science, the idea that the definition of a state, of a functioning state, was the monopoly of force. Like the state holds the monopoly of force.
Yeah.
Well, that's not the case, right?
Yeah.
In the United States. Probably it is the case in most other Western democracies. So we are fighting a battle with not a state, and it's obviously an extra state actor, but I think that we have to stop being surprised.
Yes.
There is no bottom.
That's correct.
1939 to 1945 shows us that there is no bottom, and it can absolutely happen here, and it's begun happening here. So that's my soapbox. I think some people see it, but I think that you're right that, first of all, people don't vote on policy. They don't. They vote on emotion.
If they voted on policy, 75% of the people that voted for Trump would never vote for Trump. His policies are demonstrably terrible for them.
Exactly.
It's not about policy.
No, it's about how they feel.
Yeah.
So we have to get much better at, and the right is really good at saying, those drag queens, they're going to corrupt your kid.
Mm-hmm.
Those trans kids at your kid's school, they're going to convert your child. And we have to get much better at saying, our kid, we need to have power over us. And every one of those kids, any one of the people who would take an AR-15 to us, it could be any one of us. And I think it's easy for us to compartmentalize because we have to. I think if you are really thinking about what's going to happen to your kid at school that day, you would be unable to function.
Yeah.
Right. I live in Massachusetts, so our gun laws are way stronger and we have a lot less gun violence. So that lets me compartmentalize a little bit, right? I'm Jewish. My kid goes to a Jewish school. That means we have way more security than any regular school. That allows me to compartmentalize. So I think that part of what you're seeing is that the horror of what could happen feels like too much to take in, you know?
Well, it's a big problem.
It's a big problem. And I think that what you're doing and calling it out and saying, hey, it's not just some random pundit, and I'm not just some random politician, and I have watched this over 20, 30 years. And I think that that is one of the most important things that people need to stand up and pay attention to, because often the people who are the most strongly talking about how serious this is are laughed at and gaslit and told that you're crazy, you're overreacting. What you're talking about is something that this country would never accept. And I think what I hear you saying is it's already happened.
I've already seen 15 things that people would have said could have never happened, right? And those all happened in the gun industry. I note in the book that the industry had these norms that it would not break, right? It had these self-imposed rules of decency that it adhered to. It could have sold lots of AR-15s before it did, lots of weapons of war before it did, but it didn't. Why? Because the industry understood that propagating those sorts of things and the marketing that would ensue was a dangerous thing in a complex democracy like ours. They didn't want them banned, but neither did they put them front and center as sort of this way to fix all your problems. I mean, it's not really a shock now that troubled 19-year-old kids buy these guns and go try to, quote unquote, fix all their problems with them. They're being marketed to. They're being told they could do that. So we're already dead smack in the middle. That's just one of like 50 things I could tell you about that have happened. So when people keep thinking like, oh, it's never going to happen. Bullshit, it's not going to happen. It's happening.
It's happening.
And people ask all the time, what can I do? It seems huge. The problem's so daunting. All those things are true. But you can stop by refusing to let it be normalized in your own social circles. So Think about people in Indiana. I mean, we're well through the holiday season now, but everybody has the example I use, like crazy Uncle Bob, right? He comes to Thanksgiving, he sits down, he starts ranting about some Democratic politician and then slips in there like, yeah, someday I'm going to show him my AR-15 or something like that. And most of the time at a Thanksgiving dinner, we just go, gosh, we don't want to deal with it. Just sort of look the other way. We have to stop looking the other way. You got to say,
That's right.
Uncle Bob, you don't say that stuff. If you do, get out of here. We have to castigate that. Because normalizing it and accepting it is how these things that would quote unquote never happen, that's how they happen. Like we keep normalizing them and then pretty soon they happen.
You know what, when you were just talking about, and that was something that actually caught my attention from your book and from interviews and so forth, about how you talked about how the gun industry had their self-imposed norms.
Yeah.
And how that you had your nice playbook and we weren't going to cross the line. And then there came a moment where you decided, or not you, the NRA decided, yep, we're going to go ahead and cross that line now because we're pursuing power and money.
Yeah.
It feels like, I mean, I've been in public health for the last 30 some odd years. This sounds just like what smoking was doing. They knew that smoking caused cancer, but we're not going to tell anybody about it, and all that kind of stuff. And they just kept going in all these different directions. That's what this feels like. And I know that there's been some talk about adopting, gun violence as a public health problem. I know that in our local jurisdiction here at our local health department, we talk about gun violence as a public health crisis. That's how we are now talking about those things. But I think your recommendation about adopting the language where we start calling it out, stop normalizing the crazy language from Uncle Bob, right? And start calling that out. And I'll be honest, I have a few folks in my own family who are just like that. After Sandy Hook, within 24 hours, a cousin of mine who is 1 year older than me put on her Facebook and said, "You're not coming for my guns." That was it. That's all she said. And I was absolutely horrified. I could not believe the inhumanity and that person and I actually share blood. Shocking to me. And by the way, both her father and my mother grew up during World War II in Europe. So they are children and products of World War II. So we knew what Hitler was doing and what he had done. And yet I have this cousin who could say something in the face of that kind of tragedy. That was a breaking point for me. I had no idea that could happen within my own family. So I wanted to say that because that's my moment of inflection in terms of this gun violence business.
Well, you know what I would say to that person is, you're right. What are you talking about? That's crazy talk. Nobody's coming after your guns. We're talking about instituting policies that makes things marginally worse instead of making them marginally better. That person uses the slippery slope against progress. That, like, see, and we're just gonna. They're not just gonna do background checks. Pretty soon, they're gonna take everything. They're gonna
they're gonna get a blood test from me. They're gonna take my DNA while they do the background check. I hear what you're saying.
Think about how insane this is. Okay. You get in, if you applied this thinking to other areas of your life, you get in a car, you drive down the street, you come to a stop sign. If you applied the same thinking that these gun nuts do to this, you freak out like, oh my gosh, a stop sign. Pretty soon they're going to take my car. They want me to stop at an intersection. Or you come to a school zone and like, I want to go 100 miles an hour and they want me to go 20 miles an hour through a school zone. BS. I want to be able to kill kids. Like who applies that kind of insanity to other areas of their life? It is pure insanity. And we have to start to have these picayune, like, oh gosh, policy arguments with these people. No, it's insanity. It needs to be called insanity. We need to tell them it's insane. We need to explain to them that's not the way complex democracies can function. And we need to castigate them. And if they can't adjust their thinking, then they have to be put on the margins of society and our political sphere instead of being put in the middle of it. Otherwise, we're going to have a lot more of this.
Right. And what we're doing now, which is put Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert and Paul Gosar and Jim Jordan and all of them who have faced absolutely no consequences for what they have done, and whether Trump's going to get indicted in the next week or not, whatever, it's still been 2 years. That's a green light.
Yeah.
It's saying we accept it. We accept the state of affairs, and you go ahead, do what you will, because there's no one who's going to stop you. And what you're doing right now, there's no accountability. And that started with Ford pardoning Nixon. What you're saying, call out the insanity, is really important. And the really important point of it is because there's plenty of us calling out the insanity, right? But we're not calling it out to the people we know.
Yeah.
And it's always about the people that we know that we can actually reach.
It has to start in your own social circles. I know it sucks.
Everything has to be in your social circle.
Right. People don't like good, normal people don't like confrontation. That's because the abnormal ones with the big MAGA flags and the big AR-15s, they are abnormal, and it works because
and they have a gun.
because good folks don't like the screaming. They don't want to be the one at the school board meeting that's screaming at the kids and the administrators. That's why the people who do it have so much success doing it. And we've got to dig deep. And we've got to do some things that are uncomfortable. We've got to talk to Uncle Bob. When somebody puts a bad, horrific bumper sticker on their car, you got to call them out. Social pressure works. I mean, it may be the only thing that works to turn this around.
Hey, can I switch gears just a bit? Because I know we're coming up on the hour. And as Stephanie already mentioned, that NRA convention is coming to Indiana. It's going to be here in the next week or so. And as we were preparing for this podcast, you mentioned that Indiana's government partners with the NRA. So I'm wondering, what did you mean by this word partner? And what do you think that relationship is? What's going on there?
Well, and so this is a holdover from the NRA enjoys this advantage of being perceived as this old, decent, responsible hunting organization, which in many ways they were a few decades ago. Like they weren't this overtly crazy political force that they are now. So back then, their nonprofit wing partnered with lots of states, counties, wildlife commission, departments of fish, wildlife, and parks, such as the one in Indiana, to do things like safe gun handling classes, and which on the surface are okay, right? They're good. You want to teach safe gun handling. But the NRA has now turned those into ways to garner contacts and membership, and therefore, after the events, further radicalize these people. And one of them is going to happen in Indiana. I promise you. If you go to the NRA show, to the NRA convention in Indianapolis, there will be a booth there somewhere from whatever the Indiana, I don't know the name of it, but like the Indiana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, whatever that state agency is, they will have people there saying, thanks to the NRA for supporting blah, 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 whatever. And can you even imagine if that happened with Planned Parenthood or the Sierra Club or some organization on the left? Like, there would be howls of protest from Republicans like you can't even, they would pierce your ears. Yet you're going to have Indiana, and it ain't just Indiana, it's almost every other state would do the same thing. And so they have woven their way into partnerships with especially state government that propagate this and make us calling out crazy Uncle Bob and make it a lot harder because they seem legit in some ways.
Right. They do seem legit. And this idea, this nostalgia for the image of, as you described in your own childhood, dad taking out his boys and going hunting, where those of us who didn't have that experience, I can't even connect with that, Ryan, because all I see is mass shootings. That's all I see is dead children. Schools and dead children. That's what guns evoke for me. Yeah. And so this idea that this nostalgia for hunting, we don't have to forage for our food anymore. We go to Costco and we go to Meijer and we go to Kroger, et cetera, et cetera. So this idea that we need the guns for hunting, it just makes my head explode. And that's where my rub comes in. At the same time, I also want to learn from you about how to work with you. Right? I don't want to hear your story about the nostalgia you have for hunting because all I see are dead children. Yeah. At the same time, you're telling me that I need to be working with you and others who are these more moderate, conservative, wanting responsible gun laws. And I guess we've got to get to a place where, well, how do you get all of us in the same room together so we can start having those conversations? Because I have never witnessed those. I mean, I am in Indiana, so that might be a little harder. But where are those conversations happening now?
I didn't draw you up, Heidi, but like you are one of the people I wrote the book for, because the first part of that book is me trying to explain to people like you why there is this deep cultural connection to guns and why it doesn't always have to be bad. And I think that if we are going to win the culture war, we are going to, the people who see the world like you do, And the people who see the world like I do are going to come together as a force, and we're going to castigate the crazies on the right. That's the way it has to happen.
I agree with you. I
And
totally agree with you that we have to come together and be able to work together to do that.
one of the ways is, though, we've got to play hardball. And I think that means calling out classic wedge politics, right? You agree on the things you agree and you wedge the things you disagree. Well, I can tell you there are tons of people like me who want their guns, grew up with guns, hunt with them, are never going to do anything illegal with a gun, who detest the sort of dangerous, irresponsible advertising, gun running culture that now exists. And we have to figure out a way to partner on that, because that is something that we agree on.
Ryan said that you wrote the book for people like me. Okay. So the folks who have the nostalgia for the hunting and so forth and want to have the guns, are they willing to accept my experience? Right. So if I have to come halfway, right, so that I can understand what your experience is, are they willing to come this way to be able to say, I understand Heidi's experience?
I think they do already. They do already. What we have to do is shift the terms of the culture war. Right now, they see your experience. They know it's real. There is no Republican woman who wants to worry about dropping her kids off at school either. Trust me, they don't want to. They might figure out ways to rationalize it, but they don't want to worry about that either. So what you have to do is shift the terms of the war, and that means shifting who the enemy is. And right now, I think the enemy for all of us is this crazy radicalized politics on the right. So we're hoping, right, that it's 10, 15, 20, 25% max. They're the enemy of democracy, and we need a healthy democracy. Let's face it, we're never going to solve gun violence. You don't solve things in a democracy. You make them marginally better. You don't make them marginally worse. We talk about cigarette smoking. You can still go down and buy a carton of cigarettes today. We didn't solve it. We just made things marginally better. You can't smoke on planes, public places, things like so. I mean, that's how we do things. And you have to convince the people in the middle that we're just trying to make things better. Don't let them buy into the terms of the culture war where they believe literally all their guns are going to be gone if they talk to you.
Right. It's always a zero-sum game with that.
You can't win the zero-sum game. That's why you have to convince them it is not a zero-sum game. Now, the people on the right, they want it to be a zero-sum game, and it's going to be a zero if they get their way, right? Because there ain't going to be a democracy. And do you think rights and freedoms really matter when you don't have a democracy? I got news for you. They don't matter. Like, no constitution is going to be upheld after that happens. So
I had one other follow-up question. When I was campaigning last fall and studying the gun laws here in Indiana much more deeply than I had when I was a non-candidate, I learned about a gun store in Gary, Indiana, and learned that gun store was responsible for 20% of all gun-related crime that was occurring in Chicago. I think it was in 2018 that data was from. Are you aware of that store? Do you have any insights about how this happens, that a gun store could actually be so responsible for crime that occurs in another state?
Well, so Gary has a unique place in gun law lore and the culture war lore because Gary, you talked about cigarettes and the way that changed. Well, that changed because there were municipal lawsuits across the country that basically threatened the cigarette industry into agreeing to new restrictions on the way that it sells and markets its product. There was an effort to do the same thing. Gary was amongst a small group of cities who was suing gun manufacturers back in 2000. And Indiana Governor Mike Pence at the time pushed for and signed a law that subverted those municipal lawsuits, and he retroacted it, guess what, to one day before Gary, Indiana filed their lawsuit, one day before. I mean, I don't think that's any accident. No. Since then, not long after that, in 2005, a law was passed called PLACA, Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, and it provides a broad, firearms industry is the only industry that has it. It's a broad liability shield that essentially protects against being sued for the unlawful use of any product. And now, the loophole in it is what if marketing and sales practices encourage those unlawful actions? But at the time of passage, nobody could really look forward and see how bad it might get. And it has gotten that bad. So yes, I'm familiar with Gary and its place in this terrible cycle. And that lawsuit is still in place, but it's been subverted because of these laws that Pence passed and the federal law.
Well, Ryan, I'm really glad that you came on today and laid out for our listeners how the culture war relates to the gun industry and how crucial it is that we call out crazy people on the right, and that it's important to call out the people that we know. And that, I think, is the crux of just about everything, is that we need to be talking to the people that we know. And I'm really glad that you talked about it that way. If anybody is going to listen, it's going to be to their nephew, Ryan, as opposed to some dude out in Massachusetts or DC or wherever, right? You need to have at least some level of connection in order to really break through. So I'm glad that you brought that up. And I'm really glad that you talked to our listeners.
I'll leave you with one thing. Use the language of the other side when you're doing this, okay? A freedom as important and as powerful as firearms must require a commensurate, powerful responsibility. And responsibility kind of is a word of the right. They like to own that. So ask your friends or family or political associates or whatever to be responsible. That responsibility comes in either doing the right thing personally or through responsible regulations. We can't have a functioning democracy if we don't have that kind of balance. And right now it's out of balance. So thanks for having me today.
Thanks for listening to our conversation with Ryan Busse. Next week, we'll talk with Michelle Hornish, Executive Director of Every State Blue. Please send in any questions to WTG@HoosierVictoryAlliance.org. Also, as you know, we're working toward building Blue Indiana and ask that you make a small recurring donation at HoosierVictoryAlliance.org. We also have some new merch that you can find there as well. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. We thank you, and democracy thanks you.